Welcome, Traceable designers. Today we're making an elegant yet easy Lambrequin Valance. This is the ornate scalloped style with a center connector. I'm using king-size cotton pillowcases, so you will need 3 king-size pillowcases for a window up to 54 inches wide. You can add additional center panels. Each center panel will require 1 additional pillowcase, and this will cover 24 inches of your rod per center panel. Of course, you can use any fabric to make this valance. I recommend that you make separate side panels. You'll use the design form upside down when creating the left side panel, so those will be single fabric layers. And then we're going to make a center connector using a folded fabric section, and that will hang between the 2 side panels. The ornate scalloped valance design form is attached to the connector panel, so you will cut around the heavy line to remove all of the pieces. And this side panel design form is adjustable. You can add length, any length, to your side panels. This is also a design form that can be created as a small or large side panel. The wider section, the outside edge, would be for very wide window frames. You also have an inner upper section for adjusting the width of the upper section of the side panel. I'm using cotton pillowcases to make my Lambrequin Valance. So this does have a piping around the edges, which is why you need the king size. So once you remove the piping from around the edges, you will have a 36-inch wide piece of fabric. The valance side panel is semi-transparent, so you can see your print behind the panel. So I have the fabric facing right side up so I can get an idea of my positioning, so you can adjust that for proper placement. You can also add length to your panel if you'd like, so you want to keep that in mind when you're positioning your design form. Because these panels are pretty large, we're making separate left and right side panels. So we're tracing the design form facing up for the right side panel, then we're reversing it to make the left side panel. So turn your fabric upside down and we're going to do the placement. Now I want to try to capture the print, but I do have a few things to keep in mind. Number 1, how long will my panel be? Make sure you mark the bottom once you've positioned that, and then slide up to make sure you have plenty of room above for your rod pocket. So I'm going to be extending my length a little bit here, but I also need to make sure I have 3 or more inches above my design form for my unlined fabric section for my rod pocket. So you just check to make sure that's plenty of excess, and then you can also make a wide pocket rod using the second arrow. Now, in keeping the placement straight, we want to make sure we kind of follow the left side of the straight pillowcase. So I'm using the small sizing line, but I also need to make sure that I have enough room on top if I were to add width on the upper section. If I were to do that, I would use the small line closer to the outer edge, keeping enough fabric on the upper section if I'm extending the width, but in this case I'm not. I'm making the standard smallest width on top. So I'm measuring down to make sure I have 3 inches, and in this case I have about 4. I've properly positioned my design form where I'd like to capture my print, and then I'm simply going to place marks across the top of the design form. This is going to indicate the placement for my fusible backing when adding my lining. To attach your lining, pull out your fusible fabric backing from your kit, remove the plastic instructions. Then we're going to size a piece of backing that will fit inside of the outside edges. So we're going to cut a piece that does not overlap onto the ironing board. You want to keep a little margin around the fabric section. Otherwise, you could get glue on your ironing board, and then that will transfer to the front of your valance panel. So cut a section for the upper section of your design form. This is 17 inches wide, so it will cover most of this design form. Then remove your valance design form and then position the knobby side of the paper facing down and the paper side facing up, and align that straight across your marks, making sure you have a margin around the edges. You're going to have the upper section left free of lining for your rod pocket area. So we'll begin in the center with a dry iron, medium-high heat, and then fuse along the paper down the center and out toward the sides until that's completely adhered to the back of your fabric section. Then you can reposition your design form to check the length, then cut another piece of fusible backing that will overlap the first section, and then just follow the same process to fuse that lower section of heat and bond on the back of your fabric. Now you want to make sure this is completely adhered, and then you can peel back the paper to expose the glue. Remove the lower section first. Now this has overlapped the top section, and then when you peel the top part off, when you get to the crease, make sure you pull carefully so that you don't pull the glue off of the back of the fabric. Now you're going to cut a piece of lining. This is 100% cotton lining. You want to make sure that it has a straight edge across the top edge of the glue, but also extends quite a bit past the outer edges around all sides. Because this is a long piece of fabric, as you fuse, this might shift a little bit, and you want to make sure the glue continues to be fully covered by your lining. Begin fusing your lining on the top section. You want to make sure that's straight across the glue and it's all completely covered. You're going to start in the center with a sweeping motion out toward the sides. This will be the easiest way to remove any buckling and make sure that your lining is flat and even. So down the center and out toward the sides, continuing down. Throw this across your ironing board and then just move it a little bit at a time over the ironing board. Starting again in the center with each section and sweeping out toward the sides until you've gotten all the way to the bottom of your valance panel. Then just flip the panel over and make sure you removed any of the creases or any buckling using the same inside out sweeping motion until that's completely adhered. To position the design form for tracing your right side panel, you will have the printed side facing up. Align it across the top edge of your lining, and then make sure the design form is positioned to capture your print. I'm using the small sizing line. The first thing you need to do is measure from the top of the lining down to the length of the panel. So I am adding length to my panel, so I'm making sure both left and right panels will match. So that's the first thing. Then every time you trace one of the Lambrequin design forms, you always begin on the under inner section. I'm using the smallest width marker on top, so I'm beginning at that line and I'm tracing the under section of the design form. Carefully trace around the curved sections and then end at the straight sizing area where you can add length. So you put a little straight line there. Then, because we need to make sure everything stays nice and even, I'm marking my width, but I am tracing the outer edge of the design form to straighten out the fabric. So I'm using the top edge of the lining as my straightening line, and then I'm tracing right down the Valance design form outer edge, because when I lower this design form, I want to make sure that everything stays straight, because I will be then moving away from the upper lining. So I've moved down to my lower mark, and then I'm going to trace the lower area of the design form around to the lengthening area, the gray shaded area in the middle. So I'm tracing around the bottom of the design form and ending at the outer edge. Then, in order to add length to this particular design form, because it's very subtle, you'll just move your design form down, tracing the straight line until you've reached the maximum length for your panel. Next, I need to remove the outer width. So I have the straight line along the edge, and I've marked that. It's about 2 inches. I'm cutting off the side, but my design form really isn't long enough to trace completely along. You can start tracing down the side, or you can actually determine a custom width, and you can just trace or mark off your fabric using the straight outer edge and mark the number of inches or whatever you'd like to remove, and then use the design form to trace down the outer edge to connect those marks to adjust the width. Then to adjust the upper width, just slide your design form left, and then you're going to just trace to connect the 2 marks for your width across the edge of the design form. For your rod pocket section, you would typically raise the design form up to align the arrow along the top of the lining, but I have a pretty straight edge and a little excess, so I'm not going to do that step. I'm just going to use the excess for a little larger rod pocket. To cut out your valance, just begin along the lower section and follow the trace line, carefully cutting up around the bottom, and then across the straight lengthening area if you did add any length, and then just really take your time curving around the curves to give a really nice pretty shape to this valance panel. You will be adding edge trim, so if it's a little bit jagged, don't worry about that, because you're going to be covering that with probably some flat gimp trim, so that will give you a nice finish to the edge of your valance panel. Next, you'll cut along the straight edge. Remember, I am making a little more narrow panel, so I'm using the inner line. Just cut straight up the side and across the rod pocket section, and then you'll cut across the straight edge that you marked for the inner width to finish cutting out your panel. Then just repeat the same process for the left side panel using the design form positioned upside down. To make your rod hanging pockets, just fold the fabric section over to meet the top of the lining, leaving a little space between. Then cut a piece of fusible backing to fit inside the folded fabric. Once that's completely cooled, then you'll peel the paper off and fold the pocket over onto the lining and fuse that no-sew pocket in place. This will take a little longer, may need to press down a bit to get the heat to go completely through the layers of fabric to create the rod pocket. To finish your side panels, we're going to add edge trim. I'm using a cold tube glue. I'm using a 3/8 inch GIMP trim. This is a braided trim which will curve nicely around the edges. I'm using the 3/8 inch because you do have some pretty extreme curves here and you really need to make sure those are pronounced. So put a thin line of glue, bending your trim as you proceed around the panel, making sure when you get to your curves, you go past the curve with the glue so you can do a little loop around and then make sure that's really nice and smooth around the edges. Then when you get all the way down to the bottom of the panel, you'll then snip off the trim on the edge, and then we'll put a straight piece of trim down the straight side, the wall side of the panel. Then just glue the excess trim behind the lower edge of the panel and across the rod pocket. Now that the side panels are finished, we're going to create the connector. This is the center panel, which is used with the rod pocket and connector panels. I'm making an adjustment to make it a connector panel, so I'm adding length to it so that it'll fold over the rod and just fasten in the back like a connector. So you have to determine your width and your overlap, and that will obviously depend on your window size. So the widest you can make with the pillowcase is about 34 inches wide for this connector panel. So you're going to have to add some length so that the depth of the pillowcase is perfect, so you'll use the whole size, and then that will fold over and fasten in the back. I'm making a 23-inch wide panel, and I'd like to capture the design on my pillowcase so it's nice and centered. This is an abstract design, so it's really not a balanced design, so really any place works, but I like this big flower in the middle. I'm using the full height of this panel, so I'm folding my fabric section in half, positioning my design form so I can capture the print, and then I'm just going to remove the piping and size my panel for my connector. So I have cut my fabric out, folded it in half, and I am going to add a little bit of width to this design form. So the 17-inch tall fusible backing is plenty. I'm positioning it over my design and fusing that down, making sure there's a margin around the fabric so I don't overlap onto the ironing board. And then again, as with the side panels, once that has cooled, I'm going to peel off the paper to expose the glue and then add lining that covers the entire panel and extends beyond all of the edges. So as with the side panels, you'll begin in the center with a sweeping motion out toward the sides, of course using a dry iron, medium-high heat. Make sure you get that lining completely fused to the back of your fabric section. Then flip that fabric section over and run the iron over the front of the fabric to get rid of any buckles or any wrinkles before you continue. Then just fold the fabric section in half with the lining side facing out. Make sure you match up the print and make sure it's going in the right direction when you're tracing. So I'm adding a little bit of width to my design form. I'm measuring from the folded edge over and placing marks on my lining so it's straight up and down. And then I'm going to position my design form right edge along those marks and trace the outside right edge of the design form, then continue underneath and then slide the design form over to trace the gap between the fold and the edge of the design form. Then you'll move the design form back to your outside right marks and raise the design form. I'm raising mine about 4 inches so I have plenty of extra fabric to fold over the rod and secure in the back, and then you'll just trace up the side and across the top to finish tracing the center panel connector. Then just turn the panel so the folded side is facing you and follow the trace line to cut out the entire connector panel around the sides and then across the top. This connector panel will fold over the rod and cover the rod space between the two panels. I'm using fringe rather than an edge trim. You can use edge trim or fringe. If you do use a ball fringe, make sure you center one of the balls right in the middle of the panel for a nice balance. Then once you've attached your trim or fringe, you'll secure the edges behind the panel. As our final step, we're going to create fasteners. You can pull out the Velcro that's included in your kit. This is a sticky back Velcro. You have a hard and soft side. And you're going to need to hang this panel and determine how long you would like it to be in order to attach your Velcro to the back of your panel, because that will fold over the rod and secure in the back. So you will need to use the hard and soft side Velcro for the fasteners. You also have to attach strips of fusible backing to deposit glue on the back of the lining in order for the sticky back Velcro to hold long term. So you'll just cut strips, probably about 4 inches long or 3 inches long for the small pieces, and whatever length you need for the top of your lining backside. Then just remove the paper from the backing and secure your sticky back Velcro, and then your connector will hold really well between your panels. Then just slip your rod right into your side panels and position your connector between your side panels, and you're ready to hang your beautiful new ornate scalloped Lambrequin Valance. Thank you for joining me, Traceable Designers, and remember, you can always make your mark with Traceable Designer.